Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us once again on the World Health Network YouTube channel. My name is Ben Calderwood. We've provided short news updates about H5N1 avian flu here on the channel before. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in depth today with Crystal Burke, who is a member of WHN. She is also living with long COVID. I should mention this is a topic about which news can change fast. We're recording this on May 30th, 2024. And in fact, just earlier today, the CDC confirmed an additional avian influenza case in a human person in the state of Michigan. So that would be the third case associated with this current H5N1 outbreak. Crystal, we'll talk about your background and your interest in this topic in just a little bit. Give us your reaction to this latest news of this third case associated with this outbreak, and kind of tell us where we stand in terms of the state of the viral transmission at present.
I think really briefly, the overview as far as US cases is we had our first case in a human in a person in a correctional facility in April 2022. And that was with culling infected birds. So we knew exactly where his infection came from. The current outbreak, we've had it be quiet since then. The current outbreak started in about February. We started noticing a decrease in milk production in cows in the Texas Panhandle and an infection that they didn't quite know what was going on with until we had a human infected and H5N1 was detected. And that person, initially it was just reported that they had conjunctivitis in their eyes as their only symptom. But later they released photos of his eyes, and it's not the conjunctivitis most of us think of as just a little bit of pink eye, but actual like bleeding into the sclera or the whites of his eyes, which is very serious conjunctivitis for most of us. And then just last week, we had a second case related to cattle, another dairy worker infected in Michigan, and then today the third case. That second case also just had what's reported as conjunctivitis. Today's case is the first case with respiratory symptoms. And conjunctivitis and respiratory symptoms have been reported with human H5N1, or even more broadly, HPAIs are highly pathogenic avian influenzas, and it can encompass H5 and H7 subtypes. But this is our third one related to cows in the US, and we have had more animals infected than just dairy cattle, but currently it's I've seen a couple of different numbers online even just today. So as you said, the news is rapidly evolving. Somewhere around 67 to 70 herds across the US and in 9 states are known to have HPAIs or avian flu in their cattle. And we have seen cats and alpacas with neurological symptoms, and in the cats almost exclusively progressing to death. We've seen zoo animals of many different types getting infected and sick. So this is something that we are very closely watching, and with 2 cases in close proximity and 3 cases from cows to humans in close proximity in time versus that 2-year delay that we've had, it feels like we are on a precipice of at least concern, if not greater spread.
You're talking a lot about, obviously, focusing on the dairy industry. You're talking about, of course, transmission in numerous other animals like house pets, cats, you mentioned zoo animals. I just want to clarify for our viewers, I think fundamentally what you're referring to is concern about the virus moving from birds into mammals. I just want to, yes.
Yes.
You mentioned, of course, you discussed a lot about, as we said, these are affecting individuals so far who work in the dairy industry. Tell us a bit more about your background and your experience with viral transmission, your experience with dairy management in particular, and what's led us to be having this conversation together today.
So I often preface this conversation by saying that I'm not strictly tied to the dairy industry as such anymore. I initially had my first master's course was in dairy management, and so studying like dairy management and all the factors that go into making sure you have a happy, healthy, successful herd, including virology, epidemiology, disease management, and like every other aspect of keeping a population healthy. And most of that was based on what I would need to either run a dairy myself or be the person they consult with to figure out how to manage anything that happens on the farm, including nutritional needs. But I also have a background in veterinary medicine. I worked as a veterinary technician for a decade trying to get into vet school. It's a lot more complex than most people think. But I also currently have dairy goats, and I plan on having dairy cattle again in the future, but at this point we're renting, so no space for a cow. And I'm a big proponent of dairy in general, especially after all my training, and looking at even the more nerdy aspects, such as the dairy microbiome and how that impacts, whether it be a human, goat, or cattle source, how that impacts our lives.
Can you speak just a little bit about when you talk about things like herd management and keeping cows happy, what are the disease risks associated with feedlots with cows, etc., and what are the things that people should be concerned about, especially when we start talking about it in the context of an illness that may be able to jump to people?
So sorry, probably taking a slight step back from your question.
Mm-hmm.
The impacts to the cattle themselves, the whole reason
Sure.
we noticed this in the first place is decreased milk production. Most dairies work on a very, very, very tight budget, and so every drop of milk is precious. And you get decreased milk production if you have a cow that is stressed or sick or just can't get to the food appropriately. Basically, cows are endurance athletes that need to eat enough in order to produce as much as they do. And your average cow is producing over 10 gallons of milk a day. And so if they don't eat and drink enough to produce that much milk, then they physically cannot do it, and they very rapidly get sick. And so the biggest cause of cow death is actually metabolic, of just not being able to keep up that incredible balancing act of eating and producing. So the very first impact that most of us are going to think of is just access to the supplies that the animals affected by HPAIs are going to have. So like we just had to cull another, I think it was 4.2 million chickens in Iowa yesterday. And then with this many herds infected, even if they are still able to produce milk, the report currently is that their milk production drops by around a third. And then again, anytime a cow gets sick, they're on a tightrope and they risk losing their pregnancy and potentially like going out of milk, or stopping eating and that leading to their eventual death, even if the flu itself doesn't. So it's loss of meat supply, milk supply, and egg supply are some of the biggest impacts that people are going to see.
When you mentioned milk production dropping by a third, you're referring to when sick generally or when potentially infected with H5N1?
When sick generally.
Any illness, okay.
Any illness. So in this case, the cattle within hours of infection, from the data they've collected from, we have so much data on cattle because we actually take these metal pills and give them to the cows, and they monitor everything inside the cow to an intense degree. So we have body temperature, the pace of rumination, so how much their gut is moving. They're basically a giant vat of bacteria. Cows don't actually eat grass and grain. They eat the bacteria that eat the grass and grain. And so how much their stomach is churning, We put on monitors so we can watch how they're walking. Some of them even have GPS, so we can actually track where in the dairy the cows are walking. So if you have a cow that's typically gregarious and saying hello to everyone, who's suddenly hiding in a corner, you know something's wrong with her within 5 minutes. And so we have enough data to show that when these cows are getting infected, they are rapidly decreasing ruminations, not getting up to eat or drink, getting fevers, and then decreasing milk production. So there is H5N1 does bind to cells in the mammary gland. So there is at least possibly some change to milk just because the infection is localized there. But the way cows work and the fact that they are returning to milk production at pretty similar levels to where they should be after a drop says that their udders are not, at least long-term, devastated as far as we can tell at this point. So
You mentioned, obviously, now when we were sort of recounting the news at the top of our discussion, you spoke about multiple outbreaks noted, I believe in 9 states at this point. Let's talk now about testing and monitoring. What is being done to track these outbreaks in cattle? What is being done to address the potential for outbreaks in farm workers and in the industry more broadly?
um, this is where I have to struggle not to get frustrated. Right now, we do have the most common test we have available is PCR tests. Those take time. The federal government, as of April 29th, put out a requirement that any cow being shipped across state lines was subject to testing. What I found out actually today is that currently what that means is that when a farmer ships a bunch of cows, they test up to 30 of them, doesn't have a lower limit, and the farmer gets to pick which cows he's testing. So if he picks his healthiest cows that show no symptoms on any of their biometrics, then it's entirely possible he's still shipping illness over state lines. Hopefully not. Most of our farmers are good people who would not try to infect people. But at the same time, as I said, dairies work on very fine margins. This affects the workers as well because there is a push. The CDC has suggested that everybody working with dairy cattle, especially in states where there is active infection, to wear PPE, including goggles and respirators. The human receptors that are most available to this virus as it sits right now are found in our mammary glands. Most of us don't have those exposed. And in our interior gut, deep in our lungs, and in our eyeballs. And so farmers are hearing this and seeing that the 2, at least prior cases from cattle were mainly conjunctivitis, likely spread through the eyes. And so they're just pushing for goggles, assuming their workers won't wear respirators. And there are some commentary that especially farm workers won't wear respirators as the temperatures rise. But I think anybody who works in the dairy industry watching this knows that all the workers are likely wearing jeans and long sleeve shirts and coveralls over everything. Like, they're wearing layers as is. So respirator's not going to increase their temperature that much. So there's a bit of infantilization of farm workers and what they are willing to tolerate in order to stay healthy and keep their families healthy. A lot of people who work with animals, including our farm workers, want to keep their families and communities healthy. So this is something where I feel like if it's explained to them, they are likely to do more. I actually just got data about testing today in humans, and apparently they have been offering testing. The ag department just announced another $824 million towards more testing and surveillance, and they are surveilling 350 farm workers, but only 40 people have been tested in this country so far. That is not a lot, seeing as how we know that this is in more than 40 dairies around the country. You would think at least one person would be tested from each.
Yeah. Can I follow up for a moment? You spoke when we started talking about this particular topic about testing that occurs when cattle are shipped from one dairy to another, from one location to another. For people that are perhaps less familiar with where the food comes from, and dairy in particular, what I'm understanding is that cattle are routinely, I gather, shipped from dairy to dairy. That's not an infrequent occurrence. That's regular in the milk industry and the beef industry, I presume, as well.
Yeah, so your average dairy is run with around a third of the cows in milk at any time.
I see.
You need to constantly be replacing those. So as your cows get old enough to come out of milking and be retired either to pasture for the few family friend cows or sent off to be turned into typically hamburger or like McDonald's is one of the top purchasers of dairy beef. Like it's you need to constantly bring in young cattle, and then people are always trying to buy your newest generation of cows is supposed to be better than your prior generation or your current generation. So you are constantly on
In
the
terms of
lookout.
production, you're
In
saying.
terms of production, yeah.
Okay.
So you're constantly on the lookout for dairy cows that are producing more milk or more fat or more protein, whatever it is that your processor in your area wants most to buy. And that's another thing is typically most milk is produced on farm, and many farms are currently like 1,000 to 10,000 cows. So these are typically very large operations. And then all of that milk is picked up in a giant truck, and then several trucks all drive together to the milk processor where the milk is then processed. So it's each step of the way, there is testing that occurs, but at this point, viral testing is not. There is a push to start routine testing for H5N1, but it is thus far voluntary, and the incentive is just that if you test clean for 3 weeks, you don't have to test your cattle when you're shipping them, which might be a big incentive for a very large herd that is shipping cattle in and out on a regular basis, or who contracts with a calf raiser who raises up their cattle for them until they're old enough to be milk animals, or some other setup where there's frequent movement of cattle in and out.
Seems from a layman's perspective, the nature of the dairy industry is such that if you combine the frequent, forgive the term, recycling of cattle, the frequent movement of cattle with relatively, as I understand it, lax testing standards, there's your vector for potential viral transmission in a nutshell.
Yeah.
We're interpreting this correctly, I think.
Yeah, your goal is to have cattle that are in as many lactations as possible, but the average, last I knew, and it's possible my information's out of date, the average is that a cow gets through 3 to 6 lactations. So that's 3 to 6 years on a dairy producing milk. So it is a relatively common cycle for them to go in or out of the facility.
I mean, let's talk a little bit here about the process of pasteurization briefly. We understand that broadly speaking, pasteurization should deactivate H5N1. Can you tell us a little bit about what that process involves, and if there are any concerns regarding how effective it is in terms of deactivating H5N1?
My understanding is still that every drop of milk is going through in a one-way flow. Like on the dairy, the second it comes out of the cow, it is run through filters and cooled very rapidly. There's actually requirements for this. Your dairy must cool your milk within, it's like 15 minutes down to refrigeration temperatures. And it typically goes through multiple filters on the way through there. And then it sits in the bulk tank, is tested again, processed typically through another set of filters as it's put onto the truck. And then once on the truck, tested again, sent to the large processor and run through some more filters. And then all of it is cycled through this giant tornado that separates milk fats and proteins and water, and then remixes them up to the standard milk volumes you buy in the store of your low fat 1%, 2%, and whole milk. And then it is run through a single pipe and pasteurized. And it is basically split out typically into very low volumes, if not micro droplets, and heated. I don't remember the temperature off the top of my head right now, but heated very quickly to a point above boiling and then very rapidly cooled. And it's kept there for a set amount of time, which has so much testing and data behind it that this is a temperature that is pretty much guaranteed to kill all bacteria and viruses that are present in the milk. I have heard from a couple of folks in WHN that they have seen reports that this is not 100% effective at all times. I don't know how at least avian flu could possibly get through, because it's not a very strong virus, but that doesn't mean that it's not possible. What I'm seeing is the rates of miss are incredibly low, and it makes me wonder, like, whether it's an older processor that still has stuff getting through, because the new ones, like I said, micro droplets heated to flash heat, and it doesn't feel like a virus should be able to survive. But for the most part, testing milk from, I think it's 38 states, they tested milk from commercially bought milk all over, and they were able to get PCR testing to show that the milk had been infected, but trying to actually culture the virus, they were not able to successfully culture it, which seems to show that the proteins of the virus were present in the milk. So the milk, if raw, would have had the live virus in it, but does not seem to have any live virus in it after pasteurization. So the milk you buy from the store is, as far as all the data we have currently, incredibly safe. Just don't drink raw milk.
And we'll talk more about that topic in a little bit. That is, needless to say, a warning that everybody we've spoken to about this topic has given us so far. Good advice. When we look at the potential for more widespread outbreaks of H5N1 and the impacts it could have on the dairy industry and, of course, on potentially humans down the road, how are farmers, how is the industry reacting to this news? Are they taking steps? Give us some context around actions in the past and how they're reacting to this concern today.
It gets very complicated very quickly, but for the most part, many agricultural centers are typically in rural and often more conservative areas. And many of them have been fed a lot of misinformation or had instances occur that lead them to distrust the government. And that's why I'm not going to say like everything they believe is a conspiracy theory. There have been actual events occurring to farmers that make them distrust the government. So when the government starts telling them that in order to stay safe, they need to put masks on their workers, start testing their workers, turn over data on their cattle, they don't trust it. At least the bulk of them don't. There have been a couple of heroes who have come out and actually like offered up the details about what happened to their cattle when infected, and have actually started putting goggles on their workers as soon as they knew that they had infected cattle, and at least offering masks to their workers. It's incredibly important to understand, like, these farmers have to do everything they absolutely can to keep a healthy herd, because again, margins are really narrow. They need every drop of milk, and if you have sick cattle, you cannot produce that. And the few case reports we have from those hero farmers that have actually given us the data show that they lost over $40,000 just treating their cattle, and that they have multiple losses of pregnancy, reduced milk output for at least the foreseeable year, if not into years to come. Like, these are farms that might never recover. And so I think once most farmers recognize that this is the risk, is not just being on the wrong side of a political party, but actually losing your livelihood, losing your workers, and like all of the implications and harms that come with this, not just that this is a story being fed to them by big government, that I think we're going to see more biosafety pushes in farms, but we've got to get that word out to them.
Let me reiterate, and please correct me if I'm not characterizing this properly. I think primarily what you're referring to when you talk about the struggles that farmers are experiencing and their narrow margins, we're referring to small farms, perhaps medium-sized farms. We are not talking at this stage about giant agribusiness companies. It is generally correct, again, correct me if I'm wrong, these small farmers that are selling their milk to larger companies and processors and so forth. Do I have that correct? Or I just want to be sure we're characterizing
It
the
gets
people.
complicated
Okay.
because each regional processor basically controls what the dairies around them do. So
I
in
see.
some cases, you still have small farmers, and it's very few cases now, that still have small dairies that all pool their milk and send it to a processor that they have some sort of stake in, as if they own stocks in it or something. They get profits
A
whenever the
co-op
processor.
of sorts.
Yeah. So there's,
Yeah,
last I knew there was two of those. I had
I see.
heard one of those was dismantled and possibly the second one, but I'm not sure. What has been occurring for the most part has been that large corporations have bought over the processors and then either forced farmers into contracts where they sign up for a certain dollar price for every gallon of clean
Yeah.
milk that they provide, or that they get bought out completely. But it's still the farmer who owns the farms, owns the cattle. So any losses he pays for, and the corporation just doesn't have to pay him if he doesn't succeed at providing them what they want. So it is very variable, but depending upon the setup, it is incredibly costly to a farmer to have anything happen in the milk industry that affects how much money he's able to get. And this is why over the last 1 to 3 decades, we have seen a massive spike in suicides by dairy farmers. Because if they end up getting sick, or their cattle get sick, or their workers get sick, or anything that undercuts their bottom line, they lose everything. And so it's like I said, there is in no way, shape, or form farmers who are just ignoring this. It's they can't survive if this hits their farm.
Are there any sort of safety nets in place for people in this position? Is there any sort of support for dairy farmers, for small farmers more broadly?
Ironically, the biggest supports are actually through the federal government. Most dairies could not exist right now if not for what is typically called milk checks from the federal government to support them in supplying our country's stockpile of cheese and dairy products. And part of that comes through WIC, Women and Children, Women and Infants and Children program.
Yes.
And what was typically called food stamps. There's another name for it now, but it's not in my head. But so many farmers could not exist without either growing crops or doing the things they need to do to be supported by the federal government. And so some of what I'm hoping to see is a bit more incentive provided by the government to actually like do a bit more biosecurity and more monitoring, and allowing more federal input or state input or county input into monitoring their cattle and trying to prevent further spread of H5N1.
So, and I think that sort of transitions nicely into our next topic, and you've addressed this to some extent already. Let's talk a bit about, are there established protocols for handling an outbreak of this nature amongst dairy cattle, amongst farm animals in general? Are those protocols being adhered to? I know you discussed the need for farmers to pay close attention to this because it so dramatically impacts their bottom line. Let's talk about the circumstances around this.
So that again also very much depends upon state and region. So as I stated before, they actually noticed a decrease in milk production in the Texas Panhandle. So they knew something was happening. And that data and information was getting to the state vets. Each state and typically county, at least that has a high agriculture presence, has a federal or state official that's typically a veterinarian in charge of like monitoring for epidemiological threats. Part of this is actually something we've had for a very long time, and part of it has been a part of the pandemic planning and biosecurity threat setups that we've had for well over a decade now. I actually was part of my regional 2009 to 2015 pandemic planning committee. And in this case, I worked with the college and attended the events we had, talking to farmers about like how to monitor your cows for disease outbreaks, especially for the ones that were most common at that point. How to offer biosecurity so that way you actually like monitored who came on and off of your farm and when, so that way if there was a terrorist threat and they said they were going to infect our food supply, people would potentially know where it was happening and be able to prevent it. And so we have all these monitoring things in place, but a lot of them were dismantled over the last few years, especially under the prior administration, as they were trying to undo a lot of the work of the administration that they saw prior to them. And some of this, like I said, has been set up for more decades than that. So we do dairy testing anyway. Your milk actually cannot be processed into foodstuffs unless it has a lower than, the last number that's in my head is 400,000 somatic cells. It's a SCC, somatic cell count. And we've got a higher allowance in the US than other countries. Somatic cell count is cells that have a nucleus. So that's going to be your white blood cells, your immune response, or bacteria flourishing in the milk. And European countries, for the most part, ask for a much lower threshold. Even a healthy cow is going to have some somatic cells in their milk just because of the nature of how an udder is built and how milk is produced. But so if a dairy has a sharp spike in that, you know the cattle's immune systems are activated, and that milk is not eligible to be used in food. And if that happens too many times on a dairy, they are actually pulled from being able to even send to a processor. So keeping cows healthy is already a big deal. And they get supports in doing that from, again, depends upon the region, but either their processor themselves, their state vet, their federal veterinarians. And then, as I said, it typically gets tested at multiple steps along the way, so that way the milk from a specific dairy doesn't necessarily get culled just because the milk at the dairy 5 stops down the road was too high in somatic cell count. And then so adding in the virus testing, as I said, they're doing it as you opt in to allowing it, so it's going to be farm by farm. Is a good step for identifying where it's coming from if we could get everyone to buy in. And then, as I said, they're testing commercial milk bought at facilities around the country. The CDC is doing that. NPR actually had an event where they tried to go through and buy raw milk in Texas just to see if they could see how widespread the infection was. But again, voluntary testing, so they were barred from being able to do so by the Texas labs.
Should the farm by farm testing you're describing, if the funding was there, of course, the funding presumably can be there if we wanted it to be there. Do you believe that should be mandatory at this point?
This gets into the whole like political fight that is ongoing of, as I said, of farmers at this point. This didn't always used to be the case, but this is the case right now politically, is farmers will resist anything the federal government asks them to do.
Okay.
They don't want anyone else stepping onto their land and telling them what to do. And I don't know that I believe this to be true, but the current attitude by many in the USDA and FDA and in many states' versions of those agencies is that you have to ask nicely and hope that they agree. And that if you tell them what to do, that they will dig in their heels like stubborn toddlers and refuse to move any further. So it's a thing we hope for, and we hope that they figure out how to offer a bit more carrot and a little less stick. But I think at some point, especially if this is going to stand in the way of us keeping ourselves safe, we're going to need to increase the size of that stick and make things more mandatory than not.
You're saying fundamentally they operate from a position of a courteous suggestion rather than a mandate is where we're at right now, which echoes how we may be dealing with other issues at present.
As I said, I studied epidemiology and virology and public health, and so the way we are managing many diseases right now runs counter to how several of the people that are in charge, who actually came and gave guest lectures to me when I was in my courses, how they explained we should be doing things.
Right.
But
right.
Yeah.
Well, let's, for people that are paying attention, for people that are conscious of this issue, for people that, of course, want to make an effort to keep an eye on news like this so that they can keep themselves safe, they can keep their families safe and healthy, let's just sort of address, what are the potential risks of an outbreak like this continuing? I want to reiterate, of course, we discussed the value of drinking exclusively pasteurized milk already. That is what we want to stick to. In terms of looking at other aspects of animal food production, like milk, eggs, beef, where do we stand in terms of potential risks to consumers? And of course, we can talk about the risks related to raw milk specifically at this point as well.
So the risks of continuing to allow this to spread, whatever the species, is that we increase the ability for increased opportunity for mutation. The greater mutation means the greater likelihood that it actually is going to spread into humans and become human to human transmissible. That is actually the big news about today's outbreak, is that it was displaying as a respiratory infection. Being a respiratory infection means that we are enabling the virus to get exposure to our respiratory cells and the receptors that are there, which may mean it gets the chance anyway to mutate into being able to infect human lung cells at an easier rate, or at a greater, having the greater ability to infect those cells.
Right.
And if it can infect human cells, then it means that it can be passed on. So we want to cut every possible chance of that as much as possible. You can buy irradiated eggs. They're not all that common in stores currently, but you can technically get them. Eggs in general are supposed to be pretty darn safe, especially because we are monitoring our chicken stores even closer than we're monitoring cattle at this moment. But there are signs that we can get H5N1 in meat, in which case, as always, cook your chickens and cook beef at this point too. And honestly, just cook all of your meat. The CDC actually has a recommendation for how to cook your meat and eggs and milk products if they're rare or raw. And I think it's 160 degrees, might be 165.
165 for chicken, I believe. The temperatures are a bit different for beef. I should know it, but I don't. You'll have to find that information. We'll put it in the description of the video.
Yeah, but the CDC actually has a website that they are currently keeping up to date daily. and
Yeah.
it has the most recent advice. The caveat there is they are saying that you can test with a nasal swab versus the second case that came from cattle. They got a negative nasal swab, but got a positive on an eye swab. So that would be, they've rinsed out the eye and the lacrimal secretions, the drop tears that come out of there. They collect those and test those.
Sorry, we're talking about testing for H5N1 in humans right now. Yes.
In
Okay.
humans, yeah.
Yeah.
But so if you get symptomatic, and in every single case we've seen so far, other than the one straight from chickens, people had eye symptoms, including our most current respiratory symptom today. He said he had his eyes were leaking and he had irritation. Or we don't know sex, he, she, whoever. But so you can buy pasteurized milk, which is relatively safe. You can buy pasteurized eggs, again, completely safe. You just don't go buy raw milk. You actually cannot buy raw cheese in the US. We, at least unless you go searching for it at a place that's selling it illegally, raw milk that's turned into cheese in the US must be aged for at least 60 days before it's allowed to be sold. Yogurt actually is ultra pasteurized because they can't have any bacteria in there if they want their yogurt culture to be able to thrive. So basically all of your post milk products are completely safe. And
May I mention very briefly, when you're referring to ultra pasteurization, you're referring to pasteurization at an even higher temperature than standard
either higher
pasteurization,
temperature
correct?
or for longer.
I see. Okay.
And the reason we only pasteurize to a certain temperature and for a certain amount of time is because we've done tons of studies on this and seen that if we do it at that temperature and time length, we get minimal change to the proteins, proteins and other components of milk. Mainly it's the proteins that you worry about disrupting, and that changes the flavor slightly. And some people are very sensitive to that. So that's the biggest argument that's going to be had against making all milk in the US ultra pasteurized, is that it'll cost the processor more money. But second off, that there may be a decreased buy-in from the public if the milk tastes different.
Sure. I mean, let's address raw milk briefly. I know a lot of people claim that they cannot tolerate pasteurized milk, and other suggestions. Obviously, they cite the beneficial enzymes in raw milk and so forth. Let's address your concerns about the ostensible benefits of raw milk.
So I'm probably going to say something that most people won't believe that I'm about to say, but there are actual benefits to raw milk. But like those benefits include like you can get actual lactase, the enzyme that breaks down lactose in raw milk. So people who have trouble with lactose intolerance can typically drink raw milk and digest it without embarrassing themselves in public. But and then you can get other enzymes that are very helpful. There are people who have difficulty with milk in general without those enzymes. But those are a very rare few people. There are people who have backgrounds, including me, where they have difficulty processing a type of protein found in the most common cow used for drinking milk is a Holstein cow, and they typically produce a protein that's covered in little histones. And there are certain cows and most goats that actually produce a protein that doesn't have those histones on the outside of their proteins. So you end up not producing an allergy to that milk as easily. And then there's changes as to which animals produce better milk for cheese. But all of those benefits are completely outweighed by the pathogen that is currently in our milk. It is more worth it to go buy a dose of lactase and drop it in your milk so that you can drink that that cup of milk without embarrassing yourself in public and all the other gastric distress caused by a lactose intolerance than to even risk allowing the replication of this virus in you or in the public. And those other proteins, again, like you can get milk from it's hard to find, but so is raw milk. You can find milk from dairies that specifically use just Jersey cows, which are less likely to produce those histones on the milk, so you can drink that milk. Or you can do the, to some people, strange thing of switching to oat milk or soy milk or nut milk. And each of those has trade-offs. Like, I'm not saying they are strictly equal. As I said, I raise dairy goats. I like making my own cheese. I test my goats routinely. So I have, up until this year, had no problem drinking the milk from my own goats. And if I ever had a question or hadn't gotten testing done yet, I would end up actually pasteurizing my own milk. So you can do that as well if you have your own cattle, or for some reason have easier access to raw milk than to commercial milk. But like, go do the pasteurization process or go buy commercial milk. It's not worth the risks, or switch off of dairy entirely if that is your problem. It's just not worth the risks.
I just want to reiterate that that risk reward calculation is very critical right now. That whatever benefits people may legitimately see from raw milk or low temperature pasteurized milk are vastly outweighed right now by the potential to be sickened by H5N1 and to contribute to a growing viral infection right now. So just reiterating for our audience.
Sorry, I guess
go ahead.
One thing to add to that last discussion is there are also a huge amount of people, especially chronically ill people, who cannot get treatment for their illnesses, that have been told that drinking raw milk provides them access to immunosupports from that raw milk that they can't otherwise get.
I see.
And again, chronically ill people are going to be the most susceptible to any illness. And so again, that risk reward calculation is incredibly important there, and not worth it at this time.
Understood. No, thank you for adding that reminder. As we come to the end of this really interesting discussion, as somebody, again, Crystal, who you raise your own livestock, you've been very invested in these topics for quite a long time, well before our current pandemic. Tell us just some sort of parting thoughts, if you have them, regarding what we should be looking out for, how we should keep an eye on this news in the future, and things that we should consider, I suppose, members of the general public that we should consider, and perhaps for people in the dairy industry, farm workers, and so on.
I guess the big things that I would say is don't drink raw milk, yet again, as a reminder.
Yeah.
The people who are spreading pseudoscience, or worse, trying to talk people into drinking raw milk to inoculate themselves, like purposefully looking for infected milk to drink it, trying to inoculate themselves. That's not quite how vaccines were made. Please don't do that. There are going to be bad actors in this space, just like there was in COVID, just like there was with swine flu before this, just like all throughout our history. There are bad actors who will try to talk you into doing risky and dangerous things. Please watch out for them. Look for reputable news sources to verify anything you hear. And wear a mask. Again, this is a respiratory pathogen, and that's what we're afraid of, is it getting into human lungs. And so monitor for further human infections and monitor for pig infections. If H5N1 gets into pigs, it will have, again, that same thing that it's potentially finding in a human host right now, is access to other human lung cells where it can replicate and mutate into getting into a human host. That's part of why swine flu was so dangerous, and part of why every single time we have avian flu start to spread, we watch for it in pigs. Luckily, pigs are incredibly well guarded and have amazing biosecurity. Part of that's because of their own immune system issues. But those would be the big things to watch for: is don't drink raw milk, wear a mask, and monitor for further stories of infections in humans or pigs.
Thank you so much. Crystal Burke, once again, I should thank you for being so generous with your knowledge and your time and your energy to have this discussion with us today and with the WHN audience at large. Needless to say, the topic of H5N1 avian flu is something that we will likely be providing more information about in the future. As we said at the top of this discussion, news about this topic is likely to change. And so we'll be keeping an eye on it. And we encourage you to come back to the channel and keep a lookout for that. And in closing, just a little bit about the World Health Network. We're a global organization that is committed to ending the COVID-19 pandemic as a global health threat. And we hope you'll visit us at whn.global, take a look at our work, and consider participating. All right. Thank you very much. And we'll see you in the next broadcast.
Thank you.
Thank you.